because of the color of the skin. Run, but you can't hide. An eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Vote for me and I'll set you free. Rebel, rebel, rebel. Well, the only person talking about love now, brother, is the preacher. And it seems nobody's interested in learning but the teacher. Listen to me, will you please? Segregation, determination, demonstration, integration, aggravation, humiliation, obligation to our nation. That's what the world is today. Sell the pills at an all-time high. Young people walking around with their heads in the sky. Sailing the flame in the summertime. And all the people. Revolution, gun control the sound. So children like us to the moon, kids growing up too soon. Politicians send more taxes, will solve everything. And the band bleed so round and around we go. Where the world's headed, nobody knows. Destructions, tax deductions, city inspector, bill collectors, applause in the real population. Suicide, too many bills, hippies moving to the hills. People all over the world are shouting in the war.
Welcome, once again, to the Radical Imagination. That was the Temptations, Ball of Confusion. And I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist at John Jay College here in New York. The Radical Imagination is on the move, and this can be a historical moment where we reach out to each other, develop the links to our common human situation, and understand the broad, universal reasons and causes of our human suffering and misery. Grand theories that try to explain everything can, of course, have troublesome drawbacks and obvious limitations in history, but there are grand macro and micro theories rooted in a solid scientific tradition of empirical investigation by scholar activists who work and do their research in the trenches. Furthermore, they grapple with universal moral, political, economic, and philosophical themes that have bedeviled and concerned humankind from time immemorial. We have such a scholar activist truth teller on the Radical Imagination show today. His work as a psychiatrist and director of mental hygiene services in the Massachusetts correctional system has spanned decades. Over 35 years, he's use prison and prison mental hospitals as laboratories in which to investigate the causes and prevention of the various forms of violence and the relationships between these forms. He's been struck by the frequency with which he received the same answer when he asked prisoners or mental patients why they assaulted or even killed someone. Time after time, they would reply in some form or variation, because they disrespected me, or shamed me, or humiliated me. They dissed me. Out of these experiences came his understanding of a more universal theory of human structural violence, and a realization that it makes no sense to lock people up and then not give them the same degree of intensive, humane, highly trained, evidence-based, professionalized ethical care we give to those we place in hospitals. With this insight and Archimedes moment, it was clear to our guest that both the criminal justice system and mental health systems in America were broken, as are the political, economic, and moral systems that produced and perpetuated them. As a result, he's been working on developing education and therapeutic programs that will ultimately require demolishing prisons and the ideas of punishment and fear that support them, replacing these failed, dysfunctional structures with much smaller, humane, home-like residential colleges, universities, and therapeutic communities. If we truly want to radically reduce and end the structural violence that threatens our human survival, it will require a radical transformation of our whole culture, with its distorted values, prejudices, mistaken assumptions, and beliefs. But as our guest puts it, we've got to start somewhere. And we at the Radical Imagination agree thoroughly. Let's seize the moment and make it happen. I'm so happy to invite a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Jim Gilligan, once more to the Radical Imagination. And before we meet Jim in person, here is a very short explanation of what structural violence is from one of Jim's tapes.
Famines throughout at least the last century of our history have not been caused by a lack of food. They've been caused by relative poverty. The economic resources were so inequitably distributed that the poor simply didn't have enough money with which to buy the food that would have been available if they could have afforded to pay for it. That would be an example of structural violence. Another example, in Africa and some other areas, but I'll particularly focus on Africa, tens of millions of people are dying of AIDS. Why are they dying? It's not because we don't know how to treat AIDS. We have, millions of people in the wealthy countries are getting along remarkably well because they have the medicines that will treat it. The people in Africa who are dying of AIDS are not dying because of the HIV virus. They're dying because they don't have the money with which to pay for the drugs that would keep them alive. Gandhi saw this. He said the deadliest form of violence is poverty. And that's absolutely right. Poverty kills far more people than all the wars in history, more people than all the murderers in history, more than all the suicides in history. Not only does structural violence kill more people than all the behavioral violence put together, structural violence is also the main cause of behavioral violence.
Hi, welcome, Jim. It's great to have you here, and to help us and our audience understand this term structural violence, what could be done about it, and to look at some of the work that you've been doing in some of your writings and so on. So thank you so much for being here and helping us understand this. Not too many people hear about this term, structural violence. Give us a little bit of a history. Why is it not something that we're all talking about?
Well, let me say, first of all, I think most people, when they talk about violence, they're thinking about violent behavior, like murder, homicide, suicide, warfare, terrorism, lynching, duels, honor killings, assassinations. I mean, you can go through the list. But that's what most people think of if you use the word violence.
That's what the media and politicians direct our attention to. We become concerned natural disasters, as they might be seen, or catastrophes.
Well, they're
Not natural.
They're humanly caused.
Humanly caused, right.
By human behavior.
Right.
But maybe half a century ago, a Scandinavian social scientist named Johan Galtung coined the phrase structural violence to point out that what most people were dying from that was humanly caused, in other words, not an act of God like a tornado or a hurricane or something, an earthquake. What most people were dying from that was humanly caused was not violent behavior, one person killing another person. It was what he called structural violence, meaning the increased death rate among the poor compared to the rich in societies whose social and economic structure divides the population into the rich and the poor.
So absolutely, these are non-natural.
They're
They're
non-natural.
Certainly, they can be.
A natural cause of death, insurance companies call it an act of God.
Right.
When it's caused by humans, that's different. But what Galtung's insight was that the homicides and suicides and wars were not what were really killing most people. What was killing most people across the world, and including in the United States, in every country, is the deaths that are caused as a consequence of relative poverty. There are many ways that poverty kills people. One is lack of money to pay for medicine, or to pay for medical care in general, to pay for adequate housing. So you have people who are homeless and are vulnerable to all kinds of causes of death from that. But possibly the most insidious way in which structural violence kills people is the sheer emotional, psychological stress that is caused by not knowing where your next meal is coming from, by not knowing whether you're going to be homeless, the next week or not, by not knowing whether you're going to be unemployed or not, and on and on. Not knowing whether you're going to be respected as a human being because you have a respectable job and a respectable income and a respectable home to live in, and so on. Structural violence differs from behavioral violence in many ways. One is that it tends to be invisible. I mean, you don't see it on a daily basis. We see murders and suicides and wars. That's what the headlines in the newspapers and the lead stories on the television news are all about. The latest murder, the latest war, and so on. But structural violence kills people and nobody even notices. The second thing about it is structural violence is continuous. That is, it goes on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year. Whereas behavioral violence, like homicides or suicides or wars, occur one at a time.
Episodic.
They're episodic. And so there are many ways that behavioral violence differs. But the most important of all, I think, is behavioral violence kills far more people than all the different forms of behavioral violence put together. If you look at the deaths from malnutrition, from preventable deaths from lack of medical care, or lack of education to know how to take care of oneself. And
or
so
raise
on.
kids.
Yeah.
Goes
That-
on and on, yeah.
But careful studies have been done showing that far more people die from structural violence than behavioral. For example, the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the lead medical journals in the world, published an article about the excess death rate among African Americans in Harlem, here in New York City.
Yeah.
And what they found was that a baby boy born in Harlem had less chance of living to the age of 65 than a baby boy born in Bangladesh. Less chance even of living to the age of 40.
Yeah.
And they pointed out that the death rate there was so high that it was as great as many of the natural disasters that are declared to be disasters by the president. And they were asking why it is that we as a country, as a society, have not declared the excess death rate among underemployed,
as a national emergency.
Yeah, as a
Why
national
not?
emergency.
Right.
And we have not done that. But we know that, for example, in many cities, black babies die at twice the rate of white babies. Black mothers giving birth die at several times the rate at which white mothers die giving birth. Careful studies have been done of this, controlling for all the things that might cause excess death rates. And even when you control for example, drug abuse, which actually is no higher among blacks than it is among whites. In fact, in some white groups, it's higher among whites than blacks. Or alcoholism, obesity, diabetes, you name it. Even after you have controlled for all those things, you still cannot explain at least half of the excess death rate among blacks compared with whites. The only way to understand it is that the sheer emotional stress of being locked out of the opportunity structure, the American dream, as we call it, that's what really ultimately kills people.
Eating inside of people, the shame, the humiliation of not being able to participate, feeling that you just really don't exist in a sense.
Yeah,
it's incredible.
I mean, we know that there are stress hormones that the body secretes,
right?
That kill people. The death rate among blacks is higher than the death rate among whites every single year. It's usually an excess about, out of every 100,000 population, about 300 more African Americans die than European Americans or whites. And
poverty rates and unemployment rates are several times more than whites as well. So that's the
unemployment rate is
linkage.
always at least twice as high in the black community as among whites, and considerably higher than that among certain age groups, like young adults and teenagers and so on. So there's no question, and this has been studied on a worldwide basis, so that Gandhi was really correct when he said that's the major form of violence. It's humanly caused death. That's how I'm defining violence. That's what I mean by violence. When people die because of what other human beings have done to them. That's violence.
Totally unnecessary.
It's unnecessary, it's preventable, and it's time that we recognized it and didn't spend all our time talking about homicides and suicides and wars. We need to talk about poverty. That's what's really killing people.
Okay, now, we've got that now. What are the links? You studied the examples of structural violence for decades. You've seen the dysfunctional human beings. What is that link to the criminal justice system and the mental hospital system? Many of them end up there, right?
Yeah. Well,
so why do we have this sort of system that, as you pointed out, stresses punishment and vengeance and retribution?
One thing we know is that structural violence, or relative poverty, is the main cause of behavioral violence. For example, in America, every time the unemployment rate goes up, the rates of both homicide and suicide go up. Those are forms of behavioral violence. So structural violence is not only the main form of violence, it's also the main cause of the other form, which we call behavioral violence or violent behavior. It's the main cause of homicides and suicides. And we know that these things are preventable. For example, in every other developed country on earth, apart from the United States, the gap between the rich and the poor is remarkably lower than it is in the United States. And what we find is their murder rates are only about 10 or 20% of what ours are. In other words, our murder rates are 5 to 10 times higher than the murder rates in the countries where the rate of relative poverty or structural violence is less. In America, we've had the tragic mistake of focusing not on structural violence, but on behavioral violence. And if somebody's violent toward other people, we put them in prisons where they are often subjected to further violence. And if they hurt themselves, we tend to put them in mental hospitals, except we don't even do that anymore because we have closed almost all the mental hospitals in the country, so that even people who are mentally ill are nowadays not put into mental hospitals, they're put into prisons and jails.
Or homeless shelters.
Or homeless shelters, or are simply are homeless. They're on the street.
You use the word mistake. Now, I don't know if you were being charitable there. We've made this mistake. Now, how did we come to make these mistakes? Or is this part of a structural economic political system that perpetuates and breeds this sort of thing?
I think
who benefits from it?
I think the answer is very simple.
Yeah.
And your question, who benefits, is exactly the important question. If we want to know why this happens, who does it benefit? It seems so irrational.
Yeah.
How could you possibly explain it? But it must be benefiting somebody, or we wouldn't be doing it.
Sure.
Well, who it benefits clearly is those who are relatively more rich. It's the as long as there's a gap between the rich and the poor, the higher that gap is, the greater it benefits the rich, because that's what is meant by the gap. That when the rich take a larger percentage of our collective income and wealth as a country, the higher the amount they get, the richer they are. But that's also a measure of inequality, relative poverty, and structural violence. So of course it is to their advantage to not talk about structural violence, to talk only about behavioral violence, and to say, oh, we're against violence. Look at all the people we put in prisons.
To deal with the problem.
Yeah,
and that's what so that's their narrative.
Yeah.
Consciously or not, this is the policy that is usually demanded by more of a law and order retributive perspective, which, of course, our present administration advocates.
Yes. And incidentally, I am not saying that this is simply an individual problem or problem of individuals. This is a structural problem.
That's important to point that out.
There are many wealthy people who are as aware as I am and are as concerned as I am about this and are trying to bring about changes. Unfortunately, they're outnumbered and they're overpowered by more people who support the status quo.
Because a relatively small amount of money, a redistribution of wealth, would save so many millions of lives, right? Is that?
What is remarkable is how many lives would be saved by even a modest decrease in the incomes of the very wealthy and an increase in the incomes of the poorest of the poor.
Did you have $40 billion? Was that a figure that you've talked about? I mean, the amount of in this country that would be needed to begin this.
The United Nations has determined that on a worldwide basis, everybody on Earth could have the opportunity to have adequate nutrition, adequate clean drinking water, adequate medical care, adequate education. It would cost a few tens of billions of dollars. It could be given to everybody on Earth for an amount of money that is owned by a couple of hundred of the wealthiest individuals in the world. Who have that many billions of dollars,
and that would be, I think,
their,
it was something
their
like
net worth.
Right. That would be what, 4 or 5% of their net worth would be, if it somehow could be funneled, would make this transformation. It's incredible.
Now, to solve the problem of structural violence,
right?
I mean, there are many ways to do it. One way is something we actually came close to during the period in our history when we had the lowest amount of inequality, and that was during the years of the New Deal. Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower continued that, Kennedy, Johnson. There was a period there of, 36 years basically of progressive income taxes. The highest marginal income tax rate during about the last half of that period of time was from 91 to 94%. Think of that, almost 100%. In other words, the income tax system was creating not just a minimum wage, it was also creating a maximum wage. It didn't do that as well as I would have liked to have seen, because there were many deductions that people could take advantage of.
Right.
Nevertheless, it did make a huge difference. That was the time when our rates of murder and suicide were at the lowest in the entire 20th century. So the behavioral violence was at its lowest, but also the time when structural violence was most diminished.
And particularly during the war on poverty years, too, right?
Yeah, and this culminated in Johnson's war on poverty.
Right.
And
then there was a counter movement, right?
There sure was. There was a huge reaction against that, called the Southern Strategy of the Republican Party, where Richard Nixon, and before him, Barry Goldwater, realized that if the Republicans started taking advantage of the racial prejudice and racial discrimination against blacks and Latinos and Native Americans and so on in this country, the different minority groups, the Republican Party could gain power by appealing to people's racism and their wish to be at the top of the income and wealth heap.
Yeah.
So the Republicans pursued that strategy. It succeeded. Nixon got elected. And the way they instituted it, they didn't say, we want to oppress blacks and Latinos and Native Americans. They said, we're declaring a war on crime and a war on drugs. And that was the code language, what some people call the dog whistles.
Right.
Dog whistles, a whistle so high, humans don't hear it, but dogs do.
Right.
And the point is that this was an appeal to racial prejudice that was put in a way that racially prejudiced people could hear it, but many people couldn't.
And the beginnings of increased mass incarceration. So they got
that led directly to mass incarceration.
There.
Mass incarceration started for the first time in American history.
Right.
After Nixon came into power, declared the war on crime and on drugs, which was code language for a war on blacks and the poor.
Which, of course, Michelle Alexander has documented brilliantly.
Michelle Alexander wrote a brilliant book called The New Jim Crow, showing how mass incarceration, which started for the first time under Nixon and has been going since then, has slightly started to be diminished now under Obama. But mass incarceration was a way of reinstituting white supremacy. It was a way of making sure whites would have more power, more wealth, more health, they'd live longer, and so forth. Their death rates would be lower than would be true for blacks. And that strategy worked. The Republicans have been in power most of the time since 1968. You know, they're in power once again now.
Absolutely.
And we see what's happening. The rich will get richer, the poor will get poorer, structural violence will increase, and that is the world we live in now.
Unless there are these counter movements that we want to talk about, these moral movements, and also programs and ideas that you're trying to affect as well. Tell us a little about the idea of closing Rikers and what might replace it, while still needing to constrain and restrain a certain of the violent offenders and so on. But you have a entirely different transformative idea of what we should do with people at this level.
Yes, I have spent 50 years working with violent criminals, so-called, in our prisons and jails and our prison mental hospitals and juvenile detention centers and so forth, all the different places we put people who've committed violence. And I've learned several things from that experience. One is that imprisonment doesn't have the slightest effect on the violence rate in America. At least the mass incarceration doesn't. Yes.
Say that one more time for everybody to hear again.
Mass incarceration, this huge increase in our imprisonment rate,
Right.
didn't have the slightest effect on our murder rate or any rates of any other form of violence. I'm not saying that we should unlock the prison doors and let everybody in them out. If somebody is killing or raping people in the community, I agree. We need to separate them from the community in order to protect the public for as long as they are behaving that way. However, that's the only group that we really need to be putting into prison in order to protect the public. And once we have put in prison just that relatively small group of people in terms of our population, it's a tiny minority of the population who commits murder or
Who are
rape.
presently incarcerated.
Yeah, who are presently incarcerated. Once we start putting more people in, it doesn't have the slightest effect on the murder rate, because the other people we're putting in are not other people who wouldn't commit murder anyway.
Right.
And don't.
And are more likely to become more violent under these
One of the
circumstances.
first things I learned from running mental health programs in prisons is that the most effective way to turn a nonviolent person into a violent one is to send him to prison. And I think that's intuitively obvious to most people. I mean, you can understand that.
Sure.
There are many reasons for it. One is once you're in prison, you often have to be violent to protect yourself, because you become either predator or prey. A second is because the way you're treated in our prisons is a way that is so degrading and humiliating and brutalizing.
So the
that-
disrespect continues in prison that was
Yeah.
so much part of these people's lives outside of prison
Exactly.
in all kinds of forms.
Exactly. But in many cases, it's much worse than what they experienced outside. And I've seen one person after another admitted to prison for a nonviolent crime who shouldn't even have been in prison in the first place, because he wasn't dangerous to anybody, who then becomes violent and does become dangerous, either in the prison or after he leaves the prison. Many people who come into prison commit a more violent crime after they leave the prison than they had before they went in the first place. So we know that the prisons are what a friend of mine calls monster factories. I mean, they can turn an ordinary human being into a monster. So the idea that prisons are protecting us is totally mistaken. That's an illusion that I want to disillusion people about. But the places that we, I think, do need to have available in which to separate truly violent people from the community, and that's a small number of people, don't have to be that way. in many European countries today, the prisons are run the way I'm advocating we should run them in this country. I don't know if you saw Michael Moore's latest film called What Country Should We Invade Next? But one of the pieces in that is a visit to a Norwegian prison, which is basically like a house, a home, with a kitchen, bedrooms, living room, and so forth. But it's out in the countryside, away from the city, and of course, it's surrounded by barriers, so people can't leave it. But it's out in the countryside, and they have murderers, they have rapists, but they are treated like human beings, and they are put in the kind of place that we would like to see them be able to live in peaceably after they leave the prison. And listen, more than 90% of people sent to prison do leave in a matter of a few years, and they have to, otherwise our prisons would be even more overcrowded than they are already. But also, if you can keep people in a humane, civilized, safe place while they're dangerous, they outgrow their dangerousness. Violence is very much a function of age. If you look at the murder rate by the age of the people committing it, and look over the life cycle from birth to death, there are almost no murders before people reach puberty, teenage years.
Sure.
Then there's a spike from roughly age 14 to 24, where the murder rate just increases and increases and reaches its height, and then tends to plateau through the mid-30s. And then by the 40s, it diminishes radically and rapidly. So that one psychiatrist who mapped this commented that the most effective way to reduce the rate of violence in America would be to, and he said this tongue-in-cheek, he doesn't mean that's literally what we should do, but just what the figures show. Lock anybody up who's made a serious act of violence, lock them up till they reach their 40th birthday, and then let them out.
Yeah.
I mean, beyond 40, 45, they're almost
useless,
almost unlikely to commit a further act of serious violence. And so we are wasting human lives, we are wasting the taxpayers' money, we are making our society more dangerous rather than more safe by running the kind of correctional system that we're running.
So in your more very recent work, you've also been turning to spiritual and more moral understandings of how we can transform the human condition. Michelle Alexander, we met the other week, has also been along those lines. The radical love, as we've been talking about various times in this show. What's the link there? You've talked about agape love, the need for that versus what? Eros and philia. Help us understand a little about that. The transformation toward a more humane, civilized world through nurturing and caring and radical love. Other cultures have done it and are doing it. What can we do here?
What I'm saying is that if you want to create a psychopath, that is a person who has no inhibitions about being violent toward other people, no capacity for restraining himself, no feelings of guilt or remorse about hurting other people, these are the most dangerous violent criminals in our society or in any society. If you want to create such a person, there's a very simple way to do it. Deprive him of love. Raise him in a family in which he is deprived of love, and that's what comes out. The most violent people I saw in the prisons were the survivors of their own attempted murder, usually at the hands of a parent, or of the actual murders of their closest relatives, a mother, father, brother, sister, whatever. They had suffered the degree of child abuse that was off the scale of anything I even realized existed in our society. So these guys have already been punished as severely as it is possible to punish somebody without actually killing him.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen people who had been shot, stabbed, set on fire, thrown out of windows by their parents, who survived and then treated other people that way so that they wound up in prison. Clearly, what happens to somebody if you abuse them that much, if you don't kill the body, you do kill the soul. It's called soul murder. Nobody who's treated that way can maintain the capacity to love himself or other people. The people grow up feeling they're not worthy of love, and they don't have any love available for other people. They don't have the capacity to generate feelings of love. They're filled with shame and bitterness and hate, and that consumes them. Now, what we need to do, if we want to solve this problem, at the very least, we have to begin by doing what I insisted, the whole mental health team that I was supervising in the prisons, I insisted they had to do. We have to treat everybody with respect, no matter who they are or what they've done. Otherwise, we're doing more harm than good. We're not just wasting our time, we're making things worse. We're endangering everybody. We're harming everybody. Treat people with respect. That's the beginning of love. I mean, that's the most, bland term.
And these are, again, the most hardened of human beings.
I'm talking about the most violent. I'm talking about
that's the beginning way to reach.
I'm talking about multiple murderers, serial rapists, people who were still killing people in the prison. I'm talking about the most violent, who show us most clearly the causes of all violence. I mean, that's most extreme. It's most obvious. Yeah. But the same at a more moderate form underlies the more moderate forms of violence. What I learned was, once we did that, the violence rate dropped to zero. We got in the Massachusetts prisons, there was an epidemic it was at war zone levels of homicides and suicides and riots and hostage taking and fire setting and every kind of violence you could imagine. We reached the point where we could go for a year at a time without a single lethal violence throughout the entire prison system for 12 months at a time. And in San Francisco, 10 years later, we had an even more rigorous program of education and therapy, and even non-lethal forms of violence dropped to zero. And the level of violence after people left the jail, and they were all in for a violent crime, the people we worked with, the level of violent reoffending was down by 83% compared to a control group, an otherwise identical group of prisoners in an ordinary jail.
And this would be your vision as well here in New York, closing, there's all kinds of talk, closing Rikers, and of course the governor says, well, it's going to take years and years, but
and what I'm saying is not rocket science.
Right.
Anybody can understand this.
Right.
It's common sense.
Right.
It's normal humanity. Treat human beings like human beings, and they'll behave like human beings.
You're a psychiatrist. Why is it so difficult for humankind to do this? We've got to break this cycle. This can't continue.
You know, we all of us, myself included, we all also have a great potential for revenge. If somebody does something that's harmful or painful to another person, I think almost all of us, our immediate impulse is toward revenge, but especially if it's happened to us personally. Incidentally, that's one reason we have a legal system, is because if we didn't, and before we didn't have legal systems, going way back in our human history, people took the law into their own hands. There was no law. So they would get revenge. You'd have feuds between different families and so forth. So we developed this legal system because we know that it's human nature to want revenge, but what we say is, no, don't you get revenge, the state will take care of it. It will keep you safe. The problem is the state has broken its promise. It has broken its promise to all of us. And what I'm saying, I want to see the state start honoring that promise by treating people, even those who have committed the worst forms of violence, in ways that we have learned through experience, and we've been able to demonstrate it and document it, will stop being violent. I've seen multiple murderers, serial murderers, who once they came into the world I was able to have an effect on them, haven't harmed a hair on anybody's head for the last 25 years.
That needs to be put out over and over again.
Yes.
So the politicians, the media, the larger narrative gets this. We
Yes.
begin to change the
Yes,
talk about
yeah,
this.
yeah.
It's absolutely crucial. And the place that social movements, people like Reverend Barber now, who is organizing for a new poor people's campaign, 2017-18, a moral declaration, a revolution for the country. How is that tied in? Michelle Alexander has also talked about issues of redemption and Cornel West and so many others. How is that tied in to what is needed politically, economically, and spiritually?
What I would say, and I'm glad you're bringing this into the purview of religion, because I've always regarded my work as, I've often said I was sort of a closet religious.
Okay.
You know, and I'm sort of beginning to come out of the closet. But I'd say the underpinning message I'd like to get across is what the Russian novelist Dostoevsky described in one of his novels called The Brothers Karamazov. And in that novel, there is a Russian monk and priest named Father Zosima, who says that the kind of world we need is a world in which all are responsible for all. That is, all human beings are responsible for all human beings. We are all responsible for each other, or as the Bible would put it, we are our brother's keeper. But all human beings are our brothers and sisters. And we need this kind of society where everybody will take care of everybody else. Now, the closest we've come to that on a national scale is in the countries of Western Europe, and also the other English-speaking democracies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and to some extent present-day Japan, since World War II, where the level of poverty has been virtually wiped out. I mean, they just don't experience what we call poverty in this country. The level of inequality is a fraction of what it is in this country. I'm not saying they're perfect. I'm not saying they're utopias. No, no. But what I'm saying is simply that they've come the closest of any national scale. There are some smaller groups that have done even better, but they're much, much smaller. The Hutterites, for example, who are similar to the Mennonites and the Amish.
So we have the evidence.
Yeah.
We have the social, scientific, empirical
We know
evidence.
that we know that if you share the wealth equally, the level of violence drops to zero. And that's what happened in the Hutterites, and it's come closer to happening in the social democracies, or so-called welfare states of Western Europe, that they've come the closest to eliminating both poverty and violence of any countries on earth.
And you've used the phrase evidence-based politics, right? Evidence-based medicine. I think that's a terrific phrase. What do you?
Well, what I mean is,
mean by
look,
that?
I'm a doctor, I'm a physician, and I know that there is a very strong movement in medicine to support evidence-based medicine, meaning you base your treatment for people on what the research shows, on what you have empirical evidence, what works and what doesn't work, what kinds of medicines or what kinds of surgery and so on actually improve people's health or don't, or what things make people even worse and so on. So what I'm saying is, yeah, we're all in favor of evidence-based medicine, and I'm saying, isn't it time that we also started developing evidence-based politics and use the same methods. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. I made a discovery a few years ago that totally took me by surprise. And that was that rates of both homicide and suicide in America since 1900, when we first started measuring those rates on a yearly basis, the rates of homicide and suicide have both increased dramatically to epidemic levels when and only when Republicans have been elected to the White House, and have diminished below those levels, so they're significantly even below the average for the entire century, when and only when Democrats have been elected to the White House. Now, when I first saw this, I thought, that's ridiculous.
Yeah,
It can't possibly be that simple. Politics is too complicated. There are too many variables that you can't control for, and so on. But then I started looking, well, were there causal mechanisms that might explain these correlations? Because the correlation is unquestionable. There's no question, there's no doubt that correlation is true between the political party in power and the rate of violence in America.
Okay.
This isn't my data.
Right.
It's the government's own data. It's been collected by civil servants under both parties, when Republicans are president and Democrats.
Right.
So it's not biased data. It's the most accurate, objective data we have. I just read it. You can look it up on the internet. Anybody can check it.
Right.
The correlation we know is there. The only question is how to explain it, because correlation doesn't prove causation. It's something else causing it. I found 3 things that actually predicted the rate of suicide and homicide, independently of political party. One was unemployment, second, recessions and depressions, and third, the degree of inequality in income and wealth between the rich and the poor. And those are obviously closely related to each other. They're almost like 3 different ways of measuring the same thing. What I found was that since 1900, so we have more than a century of data, the rate and duration of unemployment have increased under every single Republican administration without a single exception, and have decreased under every single Democratic administration without a single exception. And the rate and duration of unemployment, independently of party, predicts the rate of suicide and homicide.
And
so it looks like we have
yeah.
a causal mechanism.
Right.
But yes, when Republicans come into the White House, rates of violence go up because unemployment goes up. We've had also inequality goes up much more under Republicans than Democrats, and
So more structural violence goes up.
and recessions and depressions occur more frequently.
Right.
They last longer, and they are deeper
Right.
when Republicans are in the White House than when Democrats are in the White House. And all of these things can be related to the policies that
Right.
the parties pursue. For example, what causes recessions and depressions? It's when people don't have enough money to buy the goods that are being produced by the people who have capital, who own the factories. When does that happen? Well, it happens when people get poorer. When do they get poorer? When they lose their jobs and become unemployed, or when the rate of inequality goes up, or when there's a recession. But that feeds into the recession. I mean, they've caused it by making people poor.
Right. That's the vicious circle.
So so that the level of demand goes down. So the level of supply is still fine. It's the level of demand. When that goes down, that's what causes a recession and depression. So in other words, you can relate these things at a common sense level to the political party and its policies, which have the unavoidable effect that we have observed for the past 115 years.
Absolutely. There's so much more to talk about. We just really literally have a couple more minutes. I want to get a real fast little take. I know you were at a conference in Connecticut, in Yale, talking about the issue of Trump's mental health status. In literally a minute that we have left, would you like to make a comment?
Yes.
I know you wrote an article on it that's
Yeah.
fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a book that will be coming out.
Right.
My point is, I mean, a lot of people are very concerned. Is Trump mentally ill or not? Does he have a narcissistic personality disorder and so on? I said, I don't think that's really the issue. What I'm concerned about is he dangerous? Because that's what I'm concerned about. And I think there's all kinds of evidence that he is dangerous. For example, his attitude toward nuclear weapons. He has asked over and over again, what's the use of having nuclear weapons if we can't use them? He has said that in case of a terrorist attack from ISIS, he would nuke them. He would drop a nuclear bomb on them, and so on. I mean, this is crazy, but more importantly, it's dangerous.
It's dangerous.
Secondly, he said to his followers they could always assassinate Hillary Clinton if she won the election. And he didn't come out and say, do it. He just pointed out they could do it. He said the Second Amendment folks, meaning obviously people who own guns, that they could stop Hillary Clinton from nominating judges that Trump disapproved of. Well, look, how is somebody with a gun going to stop Hillary from nominating judges? There's only one way: he'd assassinate her. So he's indirectly saying, assassinate my political rival. If that isn't dangerousness, what in the world is?
I totally agree, and I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap this up. Thank you so much. You've offered a true alternative that I hope our audience will really take in. We're going to have you on again, and we'll talk more about this. Thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you
Terrific.
for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you again. And thank you all for listening to The Imagination. This is Jim Vrettos. We'll see you again next week.